When you use an estimator to perform linear regression, how does the estimator object know what is the training data set, what are the Y labels, and other properties of the regression, such as the batch size or even the number of epochs? How does it get this information? In this lecture, we'll see how we can implement linear regression in TensorFlow using something called estimators. Estimators are a high level API which abstract away all the little details of regression which we implemented manually in our previous lectures. At this point, we are quite comfortable with all the steps involved in setting up a linear or logistic regression model in TensorFlow. We set up the computation graph. In both cases, it's a neural network of one neuron. Only the activation function differs. In the case of logistic regression, the activation function is softmax. In the case of linear regression, it's the identity function. Based on the kind of regression that we were going to implement, linear or logistic, we determined what the cost function would be. We set up an optimizer, made a choice as to whether it's gradient descent, FTRL, etc., and then trained our model. While training our model, we made decisions as to how many epochs we wanted to run, the batch size for each epoch, and also the optimizer we wanted to use. At the end, we got a converged model. Now, given that linear and logistic regression are very standard, basic examples of machine learning, they're just one neuron after all, what we just did in the last few lectures seems like a lot of work. That's because we were manually or by hand setting up all the steps of linear and logistic regression. If you were actually implementing this in the real world, you'd use the higher level APIs that TensorFlow provided. You would use estimators. The code for implementing linear regression with estimators is present in the Python notebook called Linear Regression with Estimators. The first part of the file has all the helper methods that you'll need to use in order to read in your stock data. Then comes the baseline implementation of our model. This is linear regression. So our baseline implementation uses the scikit-learn library. And then after that comes our implementation using estimators. As we've discussed, estimators are a high level API that TensorFlow offers for standard cookie cutter math models. Estimators abstract away all the details that we worked with while performing linear regression manually. All of linear regression using estimators can fit in 4 or 5 lines of code. The very first step is to set up what features our linear regression will actually look at. In our case, we only look at the S&P 500 returns, so our feature vector will have just one column. The features in any regression model is specified as a list. As you can see by the square brackets here, our list contains just one feature. What you see within the square brackets is metadata about that feature. tf.contrib.layers.realvalued column indicates that it is a column with real values. X is the name of the feature, and the feature has one dimension. The fact that the real valued column is in the tf.contrib.layers namespace indicates to us that this can be used even within the intermediate or hidden layers of a neural network. The next step is to instantiate our estimator object. Because we are performing linear regression, we instantiate the tf.contrib.learn linear regressor class. The linear regressor estimator is used for building linear regression models. There's no surprises there. Because it's so closely tied to the regression model that we're going to use, it knows what cost function to use and the right optimizer as well. It takes in just one argument, and that is the feature columns, the type of features that we have to regress on and how many there are. In our case, there is just one feature. The next step is to set up the input function. The input function is the bridge between the estimator and the features that we're going to feed into the model. Here we use the NumPy input function, which is a standard input function available in the TensorFlow library. It is used to feed a dictionary of NumPy arrays into the model. Our X data or training data is available in the form of NumPy arrays, so this is perfect for us. The first argument to the NumPy input function is which features from our feature vector we want to pass in. In our case, we have exactly one feature, that is X, and that is what we specify in the form of a dictionary. The X feature is our training data set, which is present in the variable X data. The next argument to the input function is the labels for our y values that is present in y data. We can use this input function to specify the properties of our training, the batch size, as well as the number of epochs in our training. Here we choose the batch size to be the entire dataset size, and num epochs is 10,000. Once the input function has been specified, we are ready to train our model. This we do by calling the estimator.fit method. The input arguments to this method is the input function that we just set up, and strangely enough, the number of steps that we want to use to run the regression. If you notice, the input function also allowed you to specify the number of epochs for which you wanted to run this training. The steps and the number of epochs may seem to be redundant, but when you actually run this model, you'll find that the estimator uses the lower of these two values. This is what the linear regression estimator does. But it's totally possible that there are other more complex models which requires this additional specification of steps. This is the step that runs the training on our model, and you'll find that the estimator within it prints out a bunch of messages on screen so you can see how the model converges to its final value. In order to access the values of the variables within this estimator, you can call fit.getVariableNames. You can iterate over all the variables that this estimator has and then print it out to screen using fit.getVariableValue and passing in the variable name. The output here prints out a bunch of stuff. Our final bias value is in linear forward slash bias weight, which is 0.009. And our final weight value is linear forward slash x forward slash weight, which is 1.067. If you remember our baseline implementation, these values are almost identical to those. There are a number of other variables that are printed out, and these have to do with the internal working of our estimator. For example, FTRL should give you a clue that the optimizer this estimator uses is the FTRL optimizer. Now that you've implemented linear regression with estimators, you know that it is the input function which acts as a bridge between the training data set, the training parameters such as num epochs, batch size, etc., and the estimator object. The TensorFlow library offers a number of built in input functions. One amongst them is the NumPy input function, which allows you to pass in data in the form of NumPy arrays.